In 2014, two childhood friends, Jake and Ryan, found themselves drawn back into a mystery that had haunted their small town for decades. They hadn't seen each other much since high school, but when they caught up at a local bar one night, talk turned to the strange case of Alfred Mitchell. Back in 1983, Alfred's wife and two daughters had disappeared without a trace, and no one ever figured out what really happened. The town's whispers had never stopped, though. People claimed that Alfred was cursed, that something dark had been lurking in the house he built on that eerie plot of land just outside of town. The land had a history, or so the rumors went. Before Alfred built his house, that property had been home to a strange group, some sort of cult. The details were vague. No one could say for sure what kind of rituals went on there, but everyone knew something was off about the place. When Alfred's family vanished, people connected the dots. They said the land was tainted, haunted even, and that whatever those cult members had been up to, it had finally caught up with him. Alfred had spent years trying to find his family, but not in any way that made sense to the outside world. He'd become obsessed with the idea that they hadn't really left, that they were somehow still in the house. Neighbors would hear him talking to himself late at night or see strange lights flickering through the windows. Alfred claimed he could hear his wife and daughters calling to him from the basement, see their faces reflected in the windows, twisted and distorted like something out of a nightmare. It wasn't long before people stopped checking on him. He was labeled a crazy old man, and by the time he died in 2014, he was a recluse. But Jake and Ryan were curious. Maybe it was the drinks they'd had that night, or just the lingering mystery, but the idea of finally solving the case was too tempting to resist. Alfred's house had been sitting abandoned since his death, and the town planned to tear it down soon. If they wanted answers, this was their last chance to get them. So, one weekend, they packed up some flashlights and made their way to the house, planning to spend a few hours poking around and seeing what they could find. The place was worse than they expected. Alfred had clearly let the place go in his final years. The walls were covered in mold, the floorboards creaked ominously under their weight, and a thick layer of dust coated everything. But it wasn't just the state of disrepair that unsettled them. From the moment they stepped inside, they both felt it, that oppressive, heavy atmosphere. It was as if the air itself was watching them, waiting for something to happen. They explored the house room by room, finding nothing out of the ordinary at first. But when they reached Alfred's study, they came across something that made their stomachs turn. A leather-bound journal, worn and yellowed with age, sitting on his desk like he'd left it there for them to find. The pages were filled with frantic, scribbled handwriting, detailing Alfred's obsession with the basement. Page after page, he wrote about the voices he heard at night, the voices of his wife and daughters, begging him to help them, to save them from whatever was keeping them trapped beneath the house. Then came the mention of the hole. Alfred described it as a dark, gaping pit that had appeared in the basement floor not long after his family disappeared. He wrote about how it seemed to shift, growing larger at times and then shrinking back, as if it were alive. He became convinced that the hole was some kind of portal, something connected to the cult that had once lived on the land. He'd spent years trying to figure out how to rescue his family from whatever had taken them. But no matter what he tried, he failed, and the hole only seemed to grow more menacing. Jake and Ryan knew they had to see it for themselves. They headed down to the basement, their footsteps echoing ominously as they descended the creaky wooden stairs. The air grew colder with each step, and by the time they reached the bottom, it was almost unbearable. There in the center of the floor was the hole. It wasn't huge, maybe 3 or 4 feet across, but it was pitch black, like the light from their flashlights couldn't penetrate it. It felt wrong, like just being near was draining the life out of them. As they approached the edge, Ryan suddenly froze. His eyes widened, and he whispered that he could hear something, faint voices, calling from deep within the hole. Jake didn't hear anything at first, but the look of fear on Ryan's face was enough to freak him out. That's when things went south. Without warning, Ryan's body jerked forward, like something had grabbed him from inside the pit. He stumbled, arms flailing as he tried to keep his balance, but whatever was pulling him was strong. Jake reacted instinctively, lunging forward and grabbing Ryan by the arms, just as his legs slipped over the edge. It was like trying to pull against an invisible force, but somehow Jake managed to yank him back to safety. They scrambled up the stairs, not daring to look back, and bolted out of the house. In the weeks that followed, the house was demolished, reduced to a pile of rubble, and eventually forgotten by most of the town. But Jake and Ryan couldn't forget. Even now, years later, they both claimed to hear voices in their dreams, faint, distant calls, like the whispers Ryan had heard that night. The voices sound eerily familiar, and sometimes they both wake up feeling like they're being watched. Whatever was down in that basement, whatever took Alfred Mitchell's family, might still be out there, waiting for someone else to come too close to the edge of the hole. In a small, quiet town, there was nothing much to distract from the daily routine. For Sarah, that was exactly what she needed after her recent divorce, a place where she could just blend in and heal. She rented a modest house on the edge of town, surrounded by trees and far from the noise of her old life. The place was simple, almost peaceful, but soon, that peace began to unravel. It started subtly, the kind of thing you might dismiss without a second thought. One evening, as Sarah was brushing her hair in front of the bathroom mirror, she noticed something strange. The reflection didn't seem quite right, like it was lagging behind her movements by just a fraction of a second. At first, she blamed it on exhaustion. She hadn't been sleeping well and figured it was just her mind playing tricks. But that wasn't the last time. Over the next few days, little moments like that kept happening. She'd glance at the mirror and feel an odd sense of disconnect, like her reflection wasn't fully synced with her. It was never blatant, just small, almost imperceptible delays, a blink that lingered a second too long, or a smile that felt wrong. Sarah tried to shake it off, but she couldn't help the gnawing feeling that something was off. Then one morning, as she stood in front of the hallway mirror tying her hair, her reflection did something she hadn't expected. Her hands froze mid-movement, but the reflection's hands continued, finishing the motion as if it hadn't noticed her hesitation. Sarah blinked hard, her heart pounding. She tried to convince herself she was just tired, imagining things, but deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. She backed away from the mirror, breathing shakily, her pulse racing in her ears. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she pictured her reflection staring at her, moving when she wasn't. When she finally drifted off, it wasn't restful. In her dream, she was standing in front of that same hallway mirror, except this time her reflection didn't follow her at all. It just stood there, staring back at her with a blank expression, its eyes dark and hollow. Then it smiled, a slow, crooked grin that stretched too wide. Sarah woke up drenched in sweat. The image burned into her mind. Determined to get a grip, she avoided the mirrors the next day. She went about her routine, keeping her gaze low, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time she passed a reflective surface, she could sense something just out of sight, like a presence lurking beyond the glass. She didn't want to look, but curiosity gnawed at her. Maybe if she faced it head-on, she'd realize it was all in her head. That evening, she finally worked up the courage to confront the hallway mirror again. She stood in front of it, staring directly at her reflection. For a while, everything seemed normal. She moved her hand slowly, watching the reflection follow. She raised her arm, waved, and lowered it again. Everything was fine. She let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. Maybe it was all just stress, she thought. But then, just as she was about to turn away, her reflection didn't move. It stayed still, watching her with that same blank expression from her dream. Sarah froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Slowly, her reflection lifted its hand, even though Sarah didn't move. It pressed its palm against the inside of the mirror, as if testing the barrier between them. Sarah felt a cold shiver crawl down her spine. She backed away from the mirror, but her reflection didn't retreat. Instead, it leaned closer, pressing its face against the glass, a twisted grin spreading across its face. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized the thing in the mirror wasn't her anymore. It was something else, something watching her, mimicking her movements until it decided to break the pattern. Panic surged through her. She grabbed a towel and threw it over the mirror, blocking the reflection from view. For a moment, she stood there, trembling, staring at the covered glass. But even without seeing it, she could feel its presence, something malevolent lurking just behind the thin layer of fabric. The room felt colder, the air heavier. It was as if whatever was in that mirror was pushing against the boundary between their worlds, trying to find a way through. Over the next few days, the situation only got worse. She avoided mirrors as much as possible, but every now and then, out of the corner of her eye, she would catch a glimpse of movement, her reflection moving on its own, gesturing, watching. The whispering started soon after that. It wasn't loud, more like a soft murmur, barely audible at first, but unmistakable. It was her voice, coming from the mirrors, calling her name, coaxing her to come closer. At night, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and warp, pooling around the edges of the mirrors like liquid darkness. Sarah stopped sleeping altogether, too terrified of what might happen if she closed her eyes. Every mirror in the house felt like a portal, a gateway to something dark and sinister. One evening, in a fit of desperation, she tried to remove all the mirrors from the house. She covered them, turned them toward the walls, anything to keep the reflection at bay. But it didn't matter. The presence wasn't confined to the glass anymore. She could feel it watching her everywhere she went, like it had seeped out from the mirrors and was now following her, a shadow that she couldn't escape. Then came the night she heard it. The voice wasn't just whispering anymore. It was laughing, a low, mocking laugh that echoed from the hallway, where the covered mirrors still hung. Trembling, Sarah grabbed a chair and stood in front of it, staring at the towel draped over the glass. Slowly, she reached out and pulled the cover away. Her reflection wasn't there. The mirror was empty. Sarah's stomach dropped. She stepped back, her mind reeling. But then, from behind her, she felt a cold breath on her neck, and a voice whispered into her ear, "I'm not in the mirror anymore." After her husband's sudden death, Emily wanted nothing more than peace. She needed space, away from the pitying stares, the endless condolences, and the constant reminders of what her life used to be. So, she packed up her things and moved to a small, isolated house deep in the countryside. It wasn't much, just a modest old place on the edge of a thick forest, but it was quiet, far from the noise of the city. That's all she wanted, peace and quiet. For the first few days, things were uneventful. She spent most of her time unpacking, trying to keep busy and not let the grief overwhelm her. The house had its quirks: creaky floors, old pipes, the occasional groan from the walls, but nothing out of the ordinary for a place that had been standing for decades. It wasn't until the third night that she heard it, the sound that would come to haunt her. It started as a faint tapping, like something knocking against the walls. At first, she thought it was just the house settling, maybe wind rattling the old wood. But the tapping didn't stop. It grew louder, more deliberate, like someone was inside the walls trying to get her attention. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart racing, but too scared to get up and check. Eventually, it stopped, and she convinced herself it was nothing, just the wind or her imagination playing tricks on her in the dead of night. The next night, it happened again. This time, though, it wasn't just a tapping. As she lay in the dark, the sound shifted. A faint whisper, barely audible at first, but unmistakable. Her name. Someone, or something, was whispering her name from the walls. Emily. The sound sent a chill down her spine. She sat up in bed, her eyes darting around the room, trying to locate the source. But the whispering seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was as if the house itself was calling to her. She didn't sleep that night, too afraid of what she might hear if she closed her eyes. By the morning, she had almost convinced herself it was in her head. Grief can do strange things to a person, she thought. It had only been a few months since her husband died, and her mind was still raw, vulnerable. She brushed it off as a product of her loneliness, a hallucination caused by the stress of being alone in such an isolated place. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. The following nights were worse. The whispers became more frequent, always starting around midnight. They would begin softly, barely a breath in the darkness, but then grow louder, more insistent. And it wasn't just her name anymore. She could hear words, though she couldn't quite make them out. It was like a conversation happening just beyond her reach, voices murmuring things she couldn't fully understand. But there was something deeply unsettling about the tone, something dark and malicious lurking in those whispers. Desperate for answers, Emily began to search the house during the day, looking for anything that might explain what was happening. She checked the attic, the basement, every closet, every crawl space. She inspected the walls, knocking on them, hoping to find some logical explanation. Maybe an animal stuck inside the walls, or a draft causing strange sounds. But there was nothing, just the eerie silence of an empty house. As the days wore on, Emily's nerves began to fray. She stopped sleeping, too terrified of the whispers that waited for her in the dark. The isolation that had once seemed like a refuge now felt like a prison. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind outside made her jump. And then, one night, the whispers changed. They weren't soft anymore. They weren't murmured. They were loud, aggressive, and closer. "Emily!" The voice boomed from inside the walls, so loud that it seemed to shake the house. She shot up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't imagining it. This was real. Something was in the house with her, and it was getting bolder. The whispers didn't stop this time. They kept going, louder and louder, overlapping with each other, filling the room with a cacophony of voices calling her name, screaming at her to listen. Emily snapped. She couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing a flashlight, she bolted out of bed and tore through the house, following the sound. She ran down the hallway, the whispers echoing all around her, until she reached the far end of the house, where an old door led to the basement. The whispers were deafening now, almost as if they were coming from the other side of that door. Her hand shook as she reached for the doorknob, heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst. She didn't want to go down there. Every instinct told her to run, to get out of the house and never look back. But she needed to know. She had to face whatever was down there. The basement was cold, damp, and pitch black. Her flashlight flickered as she descended the stairs, the beam cutting through the thick darkness. The whispers seemed to swirl around her, growing louder with every step until they reached a fever pitch. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. Silence. Emily stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, her breath coming in ragged gasps. There was nothing, just the empty, musty basement and the oppressive silence pressing in on her from all sides. But then, she heard it again, a single whisper, soft, close. Too close. It wasn't coming from the walls this time. It was right behind her. Emily. She spun around, her flashlight sweeping across the room, but there was no one there. Nothing but shadows. And then, from the darkness, she saw it. Just a glimpse. A figure, barely visible, standing in the corner of the basement, watching her. It was gone before she could even scream. Emily fled the house that night, never looking back. She left everything behind, convinced that whatever was in that house wasn't just in her mind. It was real. She never told anyone what happened, afraid they'd think she was crazy. But even now, long after she's moved away, she can still hear the whispers sometimes. Late at night, when everything is quiet, she swears she can hear her name being called. And the worst part? The voice is getting louder. If you're enjoying the stories so far, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more creepy stories just like these. And hey, have you ever had a paranormal experience? Drop a comment below and share your story with us. We'd love to hear it. Now let's dive into the next story. It was supposed to be a simple road trip. For friends, Mark, Jess, Tyler, and Rachel piled into Mark's old SUV, ready for a weekend getaway in the countryside. The plan was simple: drive through the back roads, take in the scenery, and maybe make it to the cabin before sunset. But somewhere along the way, they made a decision that would change everything. Tyler, sitting in the passenger seat with the map open, suggested they take a shortcut, a detour through an unmarked road that cut through the woods. It would shave off at least an hour, he said, and they'd get to the cabin quicker. Mark hesitated for a second, looking down the narrow, gravel road. It wasn't on any of their maps or the GPS, but it seemed well-traveled enough. With the sun already starting to dip behind the trees, they decided to go for it. What was the worst that could happen? At first, the road seemed like a good call. They were the only car on it, which felt like a blessing after hours of highways filled with traffic. The woods on either side were dense, but the scenery was beautiful. Tall trees loomed over the road, casting long shadows, but the mood inside the car was still light. They blasted music, talked about the weekend ahead, and laughed at inside jokes that had been around since college. Everything felt normal. But after about an hour, something shifted. The road hadn't curved once, and the trees, tall, dark, and endless, seemed eerily repetitive. Jess, sitting in the back seat, was the first to say something. "Have you guys noticed how everything looks the same?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Rachel, sitting next to her, rolled her eyes. "It's the woods, Jess. It all looks the same out here." But Mark couldn't shake the feeling either. He glanced at the GPS, which had lost signal about 20 minutes ago. It just showed a blank screen now, as if the road didn't exist. Tyler fiddled with his phone, trying to get a signal. "No luck. We should have hit something by now," Mark muttered, his hands gripping the wheel a little tighter. A sign, a town, anything. As the minutes ticked by, the sense of unease grew. The road stretched on, endlessly straight, with no signs, no other cars, and no landmarks, just the same thick woods on either side. Even the music had started to fade into background noise as the conversation in the car died down. Then, Jess spotted something. "Hey, what's that up ahead?" she asked, leaning forward in her seat. In the distance, standing just on the horizon, was a figure. It was hard to make out in the fading light, but it was there, motionless and standing in the middle of the road. Mark slowed the car, eyes narrowing as they approached. "Is that a person?" Rachel asked, squinting through the windshield. But as they got closer, the figure disappeared. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone like it had never been there at all. Everyone in the car fell silent, a heavy tension settling in the air. They exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what they'd just seen. Mark shook his head and pressed the gas a little harder, trying to shake the uneasy feeling in his gut. A few more miles passed, and the road was still unchanging. No turns, no signs, just that same eerie stretch of asphalt cutting through the woods. That's when they saw the figure again. Only this time it was farther off, almost blending into the tree line. This time it was clearer, definitely a person, standing completely still watching them. "Did you see that?" Tyler asked, his voice tight. "That was the same person, right?" "Yeah," Mark replied, his voice low. "But how? We've been driving straight. There's no way they could have gotten ahead of us." No one said anything for a while after that. They just kept driving, the only sounds of tires rolling over the gravel and the low hum of the engine. The sun had almost completely set now, casting the road in a dim, dusky light. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches hanging over the road like twisted fingers. The figure appeared again, closer this time, standing just beyond the reach of their headlights. It was unmistakable now. The same shape, the same stance, never moving, always watching. "We need to turn around," Jess said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. "This doesn't feel right. Let's just go back." Mark was already thinking the same thing. He slowed the car and tried to turn it around on the narrow road, but something strange happened. As soon as they faced the other direction, the road behind them looked exactly the same as the road ahead. There were no signs, no curves, nothing to indicate they had even turned around. It was like they hadn't moved at all. "What the hell?" Rachel whispered, leaning forward. "Is this a joke?" Tyler checked his phone again. Still no signal. He tried to laugh it off, but his voice cracked. "We must have missed something. Maybe we just didn't notice." But they had noticed. They all had. The road wasn't normal, and now they were sure of it. Mark tried to stay calm, but as they drove, the same landscape passed them by, over and over again. The same trees, the same shadows, the same stretches of road that seemed to loop infinitely. They were driving in circles, but the car never turned. No matter how long they drove, they were stuck in the same place. And then there were the figures. They started appearing more frequently now, standing in groups on the horizon, just beyond the edge of the woods. Never moving, always watching. At first, it was one or two, but soon there were dozens, shadowy shapes standing motionless in the trees, their faces obscured by the darkness. Every time the car passed, the figures seemed to get closer. "I'm turning around again," Mark muttered, gripping the wheel tighter than ever. But when he turned the car around, the figures were still there waiting. They never moved, never made a sound, but their presence was suffocating, like the air itself was growing heavier the farther they drove. The road was endless, stretching on forever with no escape in sight. "Do you think we're dead?" Rachel whispered, her voice shaking. "Is that what this is? Are we stuck here?" No one answered. No one knew what to say. As the car moved forward, if it was even moving at all, the horizon stretched out before them, the figures growing larger, closer as the night deepened. The road would never end, and they weren't alone anymore. When Melissa bought the old house in the countryside, she thought it was her dream home, a quiet place far from the city where she could finally start fresh. The house was charming, if a little run down, and it came with a large piece of land, surrounded by thick trees that gave the property a sense of peace and isolation. It wasn't just a home, it was an escape, the kind of place where she could build a new life after her recent divorce. Everything seemed perfect at first. She spent the first few days cleaning up, painting, and making the house her own. The previous owners had lived there for decades, and the house showed signs of its age. Creaky floors, drafty windows, old fixtures, but nothing that bothered her too much. That is, until she discovered something that wasn't supposed to be there. It was during a routine look through the house's floor plans that Melissa noticed it. A room marked off the main level that didn't seem to have any visible door or access. She traced the lines on the blueprint with her finger, trying to figure out what it was. When it hit her, it was a basement. She hadn't even realized the house had one. Curiosity got the best of her, and she started searching. It didn't take long before she found it, a narrow door hidden behind a bookshelf in the hallway. The door was old, the wood splintered and worn, and it was locked with a heavy iron padlock. The fact that it had been hidden away like that sent a chill down her spine, but she brushed it off. Maybe it was just an old storage area the previous owners had forgotten about. She didn't think much of it at first, but over the next few nights, things started to change. The first night, she woke to a low thumping sound coming from below her bedroom. At first, she thought it was just the old house settling. Houses made strange noises at night, after all. But the sound was rhythmic, deliberate, like something or someone was moving beneath her. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening as the noise grew louder, echoing up from the floors. When she got up the next morning, the house was quiet again. It felt silly to worry, but she couldn't shake the sense that something was off. The noise from the night before had been too distinct, too purposeful. It wasn't the wind or the pipes. Something was down there. The second night, the noises returned. But this time, it wasn't just thumping. There were other sounds too, scratching like nails dragging across wood, and something heavier like furniture being moved around. Melissa sat up in bed, her heart racing as the sounds continued for what felt like hours. They would stop occasionally, only to start again a few minutes later. And every time they did, they seemed to get closer, like whatever was making the noise was moving up toward her. By the third night, Melissa was too frightened to sleep. She lay in bed, wide-eyed, listening as the noises began again, louder and more frequent. It sounded like something was pacing back and forth below her, dragging something heavy across the floor. Her hands trembled as she clutched the covers, waiting for it to stop. But it didn't. The next morning, she knew she had to find out what was going on. The locked door to the basement had become a fixation in her mind, the source of all her growing fear. What was down there? Why had it been locked up and hidden away like that? With trembling hands, she drove to the nearest hardware store and bought a bolt cutter. She couldn't take another night of wondering. When she returned, she stood in front of the door for what felt like hours, too scared to actually go through with it. But the dread of another sleepless night won out, and with a deep breath, she snapped the lock and pulled the door open. A narrow staircase led down into the basement, the steps creaking as she descended. The air was musty, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something faint but sharp. The deeper she went, the colder it got, and the walls seemed to close in around her. Her flashlight flickered as she reached the bottom. What she found down there wasn't what she expected. The basement was small, no larger than a storage room, but the walls were covered in strange markings, symbols and words scratched into the wood and stone, some in languages she couldn't understand. Old, rusted chains hung from the ceiling, and there were deep gouges in the floor, as if something had clawed at it over and over again. But that wasn't the worst of it. In the far corner of the room, there was a pile of objects, furniture, old clothes, and what looked like toys, all arranged in a circle. At first, it seemed random, like someone had just thrown them there. But as she moved closer, she saw that they weren't just placed there haphazardly. They were arranged, deliberately positioned around the center of the room. And in the middle of it all was something that made her blood run cold. An old, weathered doll, its face cracked and worn, staring up at her with lifeless eyes. The moment she saw it, the noises started again. Only this time, they weren't distant. They were all around her, echoing from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing, groaning under some invisible weight. Melissa's chest tightened as she stumbled backward, her flashlight flickering wildly as she tried to find the stairs. She fled the basement, slamming the door behind her, but the sounds followed. That night, the thumping was louder than ever, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, pacing just outside her bedroom door. Melissa tried to ignore it, to rationalize it, but every night, the presence in the house grew stronger. The noises no longer stayed confined to the basement. They followed her from room to room, tapping on the walls, brushing against her in the dark, as if whatever was in the basement had found a way out. Her sanity started to slip. She could feel the presence watching her, lurking just beyond the edge of her vision. The symbol she'd seen in the basement burned in her mind, the strange claw marks on the floor etched in her memory. She wasn't alone in the house anymore. Something else was living there with her. Something that had been locked away for a reason. And now it was free. When David arrived in the small town of Clearwater, Oregon, he thought it was just another quiet, forgotten place tucked away in the dense forests. He was used to traveling for work, spending a few days in remote towns, gathering local stories for his blog, and moving on. But something about Clearwater felt different from the moment he stepped out of his car. The air was thick with a sense of stillness that wasn't just the peace and quiet he'd hoped for. It was something heavier, like the whole town was holding its breath. At first, it seemed like any other small town. People were polite but distant, keeping their conversations short and their smiles forced. They greeted him, but there was something odd in the way they looked at him, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The streets were empty, even though the clock hadn't struck 5 yet. Shops were open, but barely any customers were inside. And every now and then, he'd catch locals exchanging glances with one another, as if sharing an unspoken thought. David had spent enough time in small towns to know that outsiders weren't always welcome, but this was different. It wasn't just a reluctance to make small talk. It was as if the townspeople were hiding something they all knew but refused to say. That evening, while having dinner at the local diner, he overheard a group of locals whispering at the table next to his. He couldn't make out much of the conversation, but he caught enough to feel uneasy. They'll know. Can't hide from it. Always watching. He glanced over at them, and immediately the conversation stopped. All three men turned to look at him, their eyes locking onto his in a way that sent a chill down his spine. No one said a word. They just stared for a few long, uncomfortable moments before turning back to their meals, resuming their conversation in hushed tones. David finished his dinner quickly and left, but that feeling of being watched stayed with him. The town had seemed normal enough when he first arrived, but now it felt like every set of eyes was tracking his every move. Over the next few days, things only got stranger. Every time he walked down the street, he felt like someone was watching him from behind closed windows, lurking in the shadows of alleyways, or standing just outside his field of vision. The locals grew colder, more distant. Conversations became shorter, eyes darting away whenever he tried to make small talk. It was as if everyone in Clearwater shared some dark, collective secret that they were desperately trying to keep from him. Determined to figure out what was going on, David started asking questions. He visited the town library, looking through old newspapers and town records, hoping to find some clue about the town's history, something that might explain the strange behavior of its residents. But the more he dug, the less he found. The town's records were sparse, almost like they'd been deliberately erased or hidden away. There were gaps in the local history, events that didn't make sense or had no explanation. Then, one night, as he sat in his motel room, going through his notes, he heard a sound outside his window, soft footsteps, barely audible. He froze, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, a low whisper broke the stillness. "They're watching you." David's blood ran cold. He bolted to the window, but when he looked outside, there was no one there, just the empty street bathed in the dim glow of a single streetlight. He stood there for a long time, staring into the darkness, waiting for some sign of movement. But nothing came. The next morning, David decided to confront one of the locals he'd met at the diner, a man named Bill. He seemed like the most approachable out of everyone David had encountered, but even Bill had been acting strange. When David asked him outright if something was wrong with the town, Bill went pale. "You need to leave," Bill said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "The longer you stay, the more it knows you're here." David frowned, confused. "What are you talking about? Who knows I'm here?" Bill looked around nervously, glancing at the other tables in the diner, making sure no one was listening. "It's not a who. It's a what. You've noticed, haven't you? The way people act. The way they look at you." David nodded slowly. "Yeah, but what is it? What's going on?" Bill leaned in closer, his voice trembling. "There's something here. Something in this town. An entity, something we can't see, but it's always watching, always. Controlling. The people here, they're part of it now. They believe in it. They worship it." David's stomach twisted. "A cult." Bill nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "They call it the Silent Eye. It can't be seen, but it's there, in your mind, controlling your thoughts, your fears. Once it knows you, it never lets go." David sat back, stunned. "That's insane." Bill gave him a sad, hollow look. "You think it's crazy now, but you'll see. You'll start feeling it. It's already watching you. You've been here too long." David tried to laugh it off, but deep down, he felt the weight of Bill's words sinking in. The whispers he'd heard, the strange glances, the feeling of being watched, it all started to make sense in the worst possible way. But was it real? Or was it just paranoia infecting his mind? That night, David couldn't sleep. Every creak of the motel floor, every rustle of leaves outside his window felt like a threat. He stared at the ceiling, his mind racing, replaying everything Bill had told him. Could it really be true? Was there some invisible entity controlling the town? Or was he losing it, falling victim to the fear that had clearly gripped everyone else in Clearwater? The answer came in the form of a soft knock on his motel door around midnight. His heart pounded as he approached the door, unsure of what, or who, was waiting on the other side. Slowly, he opened it, revealing Bill standing there, pale and shaking. "They know you've been asking questions," Bill whispered. "You need to leave. Now." David grabbed his things without a second thought. As they hurried to his car, he glanced back at the town one last time. In the distance, he could see figures standing at the edges of the street, barely visible in the shadows, watching them. Silent, unmoving. He sped down the road, the town of Clearwater disappearing behind him. But the fear didn't go away. Even as he left the town far behind, David couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him. And deep down, he knew it always would be. If you enjoyed these true horror stories, you won't want to miss our next video. Check out 10 disturbing true new house horror stories by clicking the card on the screen or finding it as the previous video on our channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments if you've ever had a paranormal experience. We'd love to hear your stories. Stay brave, and we'll see you in the next video.